A man past 35 with no wife is no longer rare, and the numbers change faster than most people think. In 2023, Pew found that about 63% of men age 18 to 29 said they were single, while only 34% of women said the same thing. That gap is one of the biggest modern dating gaps ever measured in young American adults, so this is not one strange story from the internet. And when those younger years pass, the pattern does not just disappear, because many men carry single life into their late 30s and 40s. By age 40 in the United States, about 25% of people had never married in 2021, and that was the highest modern number on record. When researchers split that number by sex, about 28% of men and 22% of women reached 40 without ever marrying. So the old picture of every man settling down by his mid-30s is no longer the normal picture, at least not in the data. That matters because people still judge single men with old rules, even while society itself has clearly moved into a new reality. Today we are going to break this into 4 parts: the numbers, the reasons, the pain, and the part most people get wrong. The first surprise is that the story is not mainly about rich playboys, because the data points in a very different direction. Adults with a high school education or less were the most likely to be never married at 40, at about 33%. People with some college were lower, and people with a bachelor's degree were lower still, which breaks the cartoon of the wealthy lifelong bachelor. In plain words, the never married man past 35 is more often working class than glamorous, and more often stretched than carefree. Race matters too, and the differences are large enough that they change the whole picture of who single men really are. About 46% of black adults reached 40 never married, compared with 27% of Hispanic adults, 20% of white adults, and 17% of Asian adults. So when people joke about one lonely guy in one apartment, they miss that this is really a large social pattern with strong economic and racial lines. The next piece is history, because this did not happen over hundreds of slow years. In 1960, only about 9% of American adults aged 25 and older had never married. By 2014, that number had climbed to around 1 in 5, and by 2021, 1/4 of 40-year-olds had never married. That is close to a tripling in one lifetime, which means the rules from your grandparents' world do not explain the present very well. So why did this rise happen so fast, especially for men? Researchers point to delayed economic independence, weaker wages for less educated men, more years in school, and the spread of cohabitation instead of marriage. They also point to a cultural shift where staying single is more accepted, so fewer people marry just because it is expected. At the same time, some men feel less able or less willing to meet the old courtship role of provider, leader, and financial anchor. That does not mean all single men think the same way, but it does show that money and identity now mix together in powerful ways. A man with shaky income may delay dating, delay commitment, or stop trying after enough rejection and shame. And when millions of men do that at once, the result becomes visible in national data, not just in private sadness. Now comes the part people fight about most. Are these men unhappy, or are they finally free? The honest answer from research is mixed, and that is exactly why the topic is more interesting than simple culture war slogans. On average, married men live longer than unmarried men, and they also rate their health better in many studies. Gallup well-being data also shows married adults are more likely to describe themselves as thriving across several parts of life. The American Institute for Boys and Men noted that married men are roughly twice as likely to call themselves very happy as unmarried men. That sounds clear, but it still does not prove marriage itself caused the better outcome. Researchers warn that healthier, wealthier, and more stable people may already be more likely to marry in the first place. That is called selection, and it matters because marriage may reward advantage instead of magically creating it from nothing. Think about it this way. If 2 men start adult life with different mental health, money, and social skills, the stronger one may be more likely to marry. Then, years later, if you only look at who married and who did not, you may confuse cause with selection. That is why some scholars push back against the gloomy view of single life. Psychologist Bella DePaulo and other single life researchers argue that lifelong single people are not automatically more miserable than married people. Some studies find the happiness gap is smaller than people expect, and some single adults build deeply satisfying lives around work, friendship, and autonomy. So the question is not simply married or single, but whether the life fits the person's actual values and emotional reality. That brings us to a key split inside the data. Voluntary singlehood and involuntary singlehood are not the same thing at all. Men who choose single life on purpose often score higher in autonomy, life satisfaction, and personal growth. Men who want love but cannot find it tend to score lower in well-being because the pain comes from blocked desire, not from solitude itself. The missing spouse is not always the real wound. Sometimes the real wound is the feeling of failure, social comparison, or the belief that life is moving on without you. That feeling gets stronger because single men often face stigma from other people, and sometimes from their own inner voice. Researchers call this singlism, which means stereotypes and prejudice directed at single adults. Never married adults report more discrimination in areas tied to family, sex, and morality, which means they are judged as people, not just as daters. Men over 35 are often labeled selfish, immature, secretly troubled, or somehow less masculine if they are still single. In online culture, some get shoved into one crude box and called involuntary celibates even when their lives are far more complex. Qualitative interviews with never-married men in 2023 found exactly that mix of stigma, pain, and self-protection. Some men described harsh stereotypes, but the same men also describe rich lives in friendship, creative work, and meaningful routines. That is important because it shows single life is not one emotional state, it can hold both grief and real fulfillment. Mental health data makes the picture sharper, but still not simple. A 2020 study in the Journal of Korean Medical Science found that never-married status above average marriage age was linked with higher rates of mood disorders. The same study also found links with obsessive-compulsive disorder, agoraphobia, and major depressive episodes. But the researchers were careful, because correlation is not causation. Being single may increase distress, distress may make marriage harder, or both may come from deeper causes like upbringing, personality, and finances. That means blaming single status alone is lazy thinking and bad science. Still, one pattern shows up again and again when researchers compare unmarried men with unmarried women. Unmarried men often report lower well-being than unmarried women, and many scholars think friendship is one big reason. Women usually maintain broader and more durable support networks, while men often lean much more on a romantic partner for emotional support. So when a man has no partner, he may also have less comfort, less touch, fewer honest talks, and less practical help. Add masculine pressure on top of that, and the isolation can grow faster. Many men are taught to hide weakness, avoid asking for help, and measure worth through status, money, and romantic success. If those three things all feel shaky at once, being single can feel like public proof of private failure. But that is not the only possible ending. A smaller but growing group of men actively choose not to marry, and research suggests many of them are doing fine. They often value freedom, quiet, focus, and the ability to shape life without compromise, and for them singlehood is a design, not a defeat. Some build strong friendships, creative lives, fitness routines, and meaningful work that gives structure without marriage. That is why one man can experience single life as peace while another experiences the same status as loss. The label looks the same from outside, but the lived reality can be totally different. Even home ownership hints at this wider story of life structure. Pew reported in 2023 that single women owned 58% of nearly 2 million homes owned by unmarried Americans, which means single men owned less. That does not just describe property, it also reflects gaps in household formation, stability, and long-term financial security. So when people say a single man over 35 has failed, the data does not fully support that claim. Yes, never-married men are more numerous than ever, and on average they face higher economic risk and more mental health struggle than married men. But no, they are not one lonely category moving through life in the same way. Some are isolated and hurting, some are rebuilding after setbacks, and some are living exactly the kind of life they want. The strongest conclusion is not that marriage no longer matters. The strongest conclusion is that old assumptions no longer explain modern men, modern relationships, or modern adulthood. A man over 35 without a wife may be blocked, bruised, free, careful, poor, healing, intentional, ashamed, peaceful, or several of those at once. That is a more honest picture than the mockery you hear online or the panic you hear from culture war commentators. If you want to understand these men, start with context before judgment. Start with wages, family patterns, friendship networks, race, education, and the hard difference between chosen solitude and unwanted loneliness. Once you see those layers, the question stops being, why is he still single, and becomes, what kind of life is he actually living? And that question is harder, kinder, and much closer to the truth. If you want the next video, watch the one on how male loneliness changes the brain and the daily habits that can pull a man back into real connection.